All right, we're going to wrap up. I guess Clay's going to go after me for a little bit, but we're going to talk about fresh cow diets here a little bit, okay? So one of the things that's interesting is that the transition cow has been a thing, right, from a nutrition standpoint and otherwise for about 30 years. Some of you, based on color of your hair like mine, have lived a lot of that as well, okay? But what's interesting is that for the vast majority of this time, those of us doing research in this area might put cows on different diets during the dry period, and then what do we do at calving? We put them on whatever the herd was feeding, right? So at the same time, folks that wanted to do lactating cow research, they didn't start the work until 3 or 4 weeks after calving because they wanted cows that had gotten off to a good start, ready to go, out of the woods, et cetera. So we've had this gap, okay? But, you know, I'd say in the last 10 years or so, maybe a little more, we've got a number of studies here that kind of help us out here relative to thinking about how we might specifically feed the fresh cow. All right, but fresh cow diets aren't new. How many of you nutritionists out there have fed fresh cow diets for any length of time on some of your herds? Yeah, right? A bunch of hands go up. Okay, they're not new, okay? You know, oftentimes over time, they're based on the high cow diet with some common tweaks, maybe a little less starch, maybe a little more physically effective fiber to help that rumen adapt, maybe a little additional RUP or amino acids, maybe some fat, maybe some transition kind of specific nutrients like protected choline. And you know, folks would say we do these things and we kind of gauge, you know, at the farm level, are we doing better or not, okay? So some of the key questions that people have been asking over the last kind of number of years, one big one has been how fermentable should that diet be, and that discussion is focused mainly around starch. And do we really need to feed lower starch diets to fresh cows, okay? And certainly there's been a school of thought in parts of academia and also in the industry that yes, indeed, we should do that because we worry about negative impacts on intake with too much starch, okay? And then what about starch fermentability? How important is physically effective fiber in fresh cow diets? I think it's actually quite important, okay? But as you'll see, we can also go too far, and that gets us into trouble as well, right? So there's going to be a balancing act here somewhere. And then finally, you know, what about protein supply to the post-calving cow? And I'll show you some new work that one of our graduate students, recent graduates from Cornell, kind of finished up. All right, to starch or not to starch? That is the question, okay? All right, so we've got a number of studies here. We've got studies that focused on starch level in the fresh diet. So this one out of minor, some work out of Massachusetts Oba's lab at Alberta, our group, more minor, Oba, starch source in fresh diet, right? So this is Michigan State right here, okay? And then starch source and level in the fresh diet, okay? So I'm not gonna take you through all these, but I'm gonna take you through enough of them to bring you to the conclusion that it's a real mixed bag out there from a standpoint of research results, okay? So, all right, first one I'm going to show here is Heather Dan, Braun Nelson. This was published fully at 2011 Cornell Nutrition Conference. That's available online for free, okay? 72 Holstein cows, high straw control energy diet for 40 days dry. And then at calving, one of 3 starch kind of regimens, right? A low starch diet, about 21% starch for the first 91 days in milk. Medium starch, about 23% for the first 21 days in milk, followed by a higher starch diet until 91 days in milk. And high starch diet, about 25, 26 for the first 91 days of milk. Now, I recognize where I'm standing right now, right? And that this is probably, for the Northeast, Upper Midwest, this really isn't that high. Probably for down here, it's on the high side, right? So I get that we're gonna have different diet approaches depending on where we're at in the country, and et cetera. So to show the diet lineup here, corn silage, haylage, wheat, straw base, pretty simple approach to increase starch. They simply increased finely ground cornmeal, so dry ground corn, okay? And then they replace at the same time soy hulls, wheat mids, et cetera. And so you see again the starch levels here. They run sugar about 6% in the diet, and again you see the rest of the diets there. All right, so I'm going to focus just on the milk and intake results here. And again, intake in milk in kilos, low, medium, and high. And very similar performance between the low and the medium, right? So very similar intake here. Argued numerically more milk here on this one, but not different statistically. But what was pretty clear was that the cows fed the high starch diet for the first 9 beginning at calving had lower intakes and lower milk, okay? So if the only study you ever looked at was this one, you would come to the conclusion that I should feed a lower starch diet to my fresh cows, right? That's basically the conclusion you would come to. Then we came along, we had 70 Holstein cows, we had a blend of first calf heifers and older cows. fed a high straw, moderate energy diet, close-up, at calving, very similar starch levels to minor. And then at 22 days after calving, all cows were fed the higher starch diet. We also had Rumensin in this study. We got a nice positive response to Rumensin, like pretty much all transition cow studies have shown, but I'm going to focus on the starch side. So, similar, again, prepartum, postpartum, one difference is we had BMR corn silage in the diet. We had haylage. We had a pretty large percentage of wheat straw. That was not the original diet. We got into some real health issues through the original diets. We discovered we were shorting these cows of fiber, especially physically effective fiber, and so we pulled straw in to fix the problem. Both the BMR and haylage were both pretty rocket fuel type forages. So that's, again, we'll come back to that. Similar to minor, we basically swapped out cornmeal for corn germ, citrus, and soy. Okay. And then in our hands, right, we basically had, for cows fed the higher starch diet, they had higher dry matter intakes, and they had better milk yields. Again, they went back onto the same diet after week 3. So pretty much opposite the results of minor. All right, Alberta, Massey Doba's lab here, right? So this was about 60 Holstein cows. The treatments fed from calving through 12 weeks after calving. They had a high starch control, so 29% of dry matter is starch. And then dry distillers, low starch 19, right? So pretty big difference there in starch level in the diet, okay? And again, they were based on barley silage, typical Western Canada, and had basically some rolled corn in there, and then had barley grain. And if anybody knows anything about barley grain, right, that's pretty fermentable, right? So barley starch is gonna be more fermentable than corn starch. And then wheat dry distillers, and again, you see the 29 versus 19, right? So if high starch is gonna be problematic, or more fermentable starch would be problematic to a fresh cow, it should show up in this study, right? And it really didn't, right? So if you look here at the results here, milk yield was the same, energy-corrected milk was the same. They did see a treatment by parity on intake, maybe a little less intake in the heifers for the higher starch, but maybe a little more in the cows, right? So hard to make a lot of that. Interestingly enough, they had rumen pH monitoring, right? And surprisingly, no difference here in rumen pHs and area under the curve, or pH under 5.8 time, or area under the curve. Okay. All right, Michigan State. Okay, so this was again, they were looking at a couple different things in the study. I'm going to focus on the corn comparison here. Okay, dry ground versus high moisture. Okay, high moisture, of course, is more fermentable through day 28. Corn silage, alfalfa silage base, alfalfa hay, dry ground versus high moisture. Again, very straightforward experimental design, just swapping it out percentage for percentage in the diet. Soybean meal and minerals and vitamins, again, about 26% starch overall. All right, results from days 1 to 28. Cows fed high moisture corn made more milk. Okay, they had basically no differences in dry matter intake or cumulative dry matter intake through day 28, right? So again, no evidence that there's any negative effects of more fermentable starch in this diet. Sorry, I know this cuts out. And certainly evidence of better performance, right? So these cows fed the more fermentable corn, made more milk. All right, and then again, I think this is the last one I'm going to show, Michigan State. Again, Mike Allen's group, low versus high starch, so 22 versus 28, and then dry ground versus high moisture. Okay, so again, you see alfalfa silage, grass hay, dry ground. Obviously, with the high starch, they increase the amounts of both of those. Okay, and then basically 22 and 27. Okay. All right, look at the results. Okay, I'm just going to, so orangey here, here's low starch, dry, high moisture, high starch, dry, high moisture. And go over to the p-values here, level, source, level by source. The thing that's very clear right off the bat is there was no effects of source. Okay, I'm sorry, no effects of level, my bad. No effects of starch level in the diet. So, and they did have effects of source, right? And so in general, the high moisture, a little less intake, got a trend for interaction, okay, for level by starch, such that that decrease was bigger in the high starch fed cows, right? In the diet. So that kind of makes sense, right? If it's hotter, more fermentable diet, higher starch, that's probably where you see the effect on intake, okay? Again, but generally speaking, lower milk yield with the high moisture, okay, and lower energy corrected milk, okay? So How many of you are confused about what to do? Okay, so a few brave souls are going to raise their hand, right? Because I just showed you a whole bunch of stuff that had opposite results all the way across the board, right? So when you dig a little deeper into these papers, right, and what we find here is the two studies here, our study that showed a better response to more starch or more fermentable starch, they had a lot more forage NDF in the diet, right? So, and again, you kind of, use it as a proxy for PENDF, UNDF 240, whatever undigested physical fiber metric you want to use, right? I don't really care, okay? But both these studies had quite a bit more forage NDF in the diet, and also higher than most lactating cow diets would have, right? Significantly higher. Down here, the ones that are neutral and negative responses, they were down more toward a high cow type diet. This diet here was only 40% forage. This diet was only 50% forage, and this one was pretty low in forage NDF, right? So I think there's an opportunity for more starch or more fermentable starch as long as we have enough fiber to go along with it to get those ruminants transitioning well onto that lactating diet. Okay. I also think that in cases where we're too much starch or too fermentable, okay, I think we're inducing inflammation in these cows, right? It's that inflammation that then is likely throwing those cows off feed, right? So versus some discussion on fuels, okay? So question is so we had some case study work that we've done. Question is, can you go too far with higher, again, pick your metric, PNDF, UNDF 240, PEUNDF 240 in fresh cow diets. And if I'm asking that question, you probably think the answer is yes, okay? So we followed up our case study. Oh boy, that does not come out well. All right, sorry about that. By the way, I'm happy to email these slides to anybody that wants them, okay? So my email's at the last slide. So we followed up our kind of case study with a study where we actually wanted to look at varying UNDF mainly through straw in fresh cow diets, right? And so we basically had a conventional corn silage. We had an alfalfa hay. Now, this alfalfa hay was from Kansas. Nothing wrong with Kansas, okay? But for any of you UNDF aficionados out there, the UNDF 240 content of that hay was 50% of the MDF. So half of the NDF in that hay was undigestible, okay? And so if it's undigestible, right, it's going to contribute to physical fill, okay? And so the bottom line is, here's UNDF down here. Again, I apologize for no contrast. Dry cow diet. We basically overshot our UNDF targets for the fresh cows, this percent of dry matter, by about 2 units. Okay, and so when you overshoot when you overshoot that target, what do you think the cows do? Or you go too much? They're going to back off feed, and likely, if you take a look at their blood, they're going to be what? Ketotic, and that's exactly what happened. Okay, research doesn't always go the way you want. Okay, got the researchers up here in front nodding their heads, sort of. Okay, so prepartum intake was fine, about 16 kilos, right? Postpartum intake, this is low fiber, high fiber. We backed them off feed. UNDF intake percent of body weight was higher, so they were trying. Milk yield was lower. Okay, and then down here, this is also interesting to us. Rumination time was like identical, which really surprised us. So they were trying to chew down that stuff. We were just throwing too much of it at them. Okay, this is my kind of like warning out there, right? So this is because we have gotten cases where instead of that half a pound to 3/4 pound, the nutritionist might put in of like not long, but chopped dry stuff, right? Usually straw in my world, they put into a diet. We would get to maybe 2 to 3 pounds. Okay, but that's usually with really good digestible forages too, right? So if you're having trouble with forage digestibility, cover your ears because you don't want to mess with any of this. You get other problems. Okay. So again, energy corrected milk. This is DMI was down. They put them back in the same diet. They came back. Milk yield was down. Put them back in the same diet. They came back. Okay. But here's NEFAs are higher. Ketones are higher. Glucose was lower. Energy balance was lower. Right. So again, don't go too far. Okay. Now, coming back to this real quick, this is the Michigan State work, right? So this was the one where they had nice response to high moisture corn. They were feeding a pretty high forage NDF diet here to start, and then they switched them at 28 days on a more typical high cow level of forage NDF, okay? Interesting, the study here, the these cows, they calve, they start taking off on intake, and then what did they do about day 10 to 14? They just leveled right off, didn't they? And then they switched that diet again, boom, took right off, okay? So I think my point here with this is if you're gonna mess around with some of this, probably the shorter the better in a fresh group, right? Maybe a 10 to 14 day fresh group instead of a 21 day. For sure, once you get about 20, 21 days, and from my perspective, you're no longer looking at a fresh group, okay? You know, I get herds every now and again to be like, yeah, our fresh cows are in there for like 45 days. And I'm like, that is not a fresh group, okay? Absolutely not, okay? That's a group that I don't know what to do with, to be honest with you, okay? Certainly nothing special. That's a group you transition right on the high cow diet and say, look, we're gonna keep moving. All right. All right, gonna spend a little bit of time on protein amino acids in the transition cow. How am I doing for time? I'm good? Okay. So meta-analysis by our grill master and his group, okay? This was looking at MP supply prepartum, okay? And basically had milk yield responses, different levels of MP predicted with the NRC model. First calf heifers, older cows, okay? Pretty consistently positive response in heifers to increasing MP density or MP supply to those cows or to those animals. Pretty mixed bag in the older cows, although if you dig further in the paper, herds studies where they were higher producing, you know, generally saw beneficial responses to more MP before calving, right? But the whole deal is a bit of a mixed bag, okay? So we do have recommendations, right? So, you know, we're still living at 1,200 to 14 grams of MP range with CNCPS, so as out there through NDS and AMTS and others. Lysine, methionine, again, we believe in balancing those beginning before calving, okay? Patrick French, you know, had kind of a meta regression review of literature here. He came up with kind of those numbers. I think one of the things we do though is we certainly focus our protein supplementation on RUP sources. We get there a lot more efficiently and likely cost effectively than if we just throw protein at them. And again, we're going to come in with amino acids as well. All right, just again, methionine's been pretty well studied in transition. We've got you know, 7 different studies here, some different forms anyway, range from analogs to protected sources, and again, in general, showing milk yield responses across most of these studies to methionine supplementation beginning before calving, okay? But you got to remember that amino acids are doing more than just making milk protein, right? So, or other proteins in the body. They've got roles in one-carbon metabolism, metabolic regulation, innate immunity, oxidative metabolism, epigenetics, okay? I think Barry Bradford calls this nutrition 2.0 or something like that. So think about nutrients as regulators of what's going on in the cow versus simply building protein, okay? Take you through a couple Illinois studies here. This was Johan Osorio. You see the number of cows here. He had 3 treatments from 21 days before calving to 30 days after calving, had a control, had an HMTBA analog or isopropyl analog, and then protected methionine. You see those levels, basically unsupplemented versus a supplementation. These are NRC numbers. You see the lysine numbers right here, okay? So if you look here, you know, again, you know, cows fed protected methionine before and after calving, had evidence of better immune function, had lower plasma serum amylase, so evidence of maybe better oxidative status, lower inflammation, greater oxygen radical absorbance capacity, more glutathione-carnitine, some changes in gene networks and things like that, okay? But not the, you know, again, when I started a long time ago, right, it was thought that methionine had a big role in lipid metabolism in the liver, and it really doesn't seem to be that way. The data support that pretty well, okay? All right, Fernanda Battistel, this is part of her PhD. I think she's over there somewhere. Wave, are you over there, Fernanda? No, she was? Okay, all right, I thought I saw her somewhere. Okay, she's a faculty member at UF, right? So treatment's 28 days before calving to 60 days post, unsupplemented versus supplemented, and again, lysine values here, and you see the ratio of lysine to methionine. Again, really nice response. They had better intakes here before calving. They had better postpartum intakes with the methionine, a nice milk response, energy-corrected milk, et cetera. Okay, so pretty, you know, again, a nice response to methionine being before calving. They also did some stuff where they were looking at just what else is going on in these cows, thinking about epigenetics a little bit. Prepartum methionine increased calf birth weight. That's not totally consistent across studies, okay? In this study, they did see it. Maybe some upregulation of amino acid transport and mTOR signaling in that gravid uterus, okay? What about protected lysine? I think Laura's in the back. She was. Yeah, there you go. I see a hand. Right, so this is part of her PhD work, also at Illinois. And so again, she had Holstein cows in her secondary lactation, 28 days prepartum through 28 days after calving. Basically had 4 treatments, so they had kind of had a control level of lysine before calving and after calving, supplemented before calving, control after calving, control before calving, supplemented after calving, and then supplemented, right? So there's methionine in all treatments, okay? So just looking at pre and postpartum lysine effects. Basically what she saw was really primarily an effective prepartum lysine, primarily in getting, there's no difference in intake before calving. After calving, cows fed lysine before calving had higher dry matter intakes tended to have higher milk yields here and had higher energy corrected milk, right? So again, a response here to prepartum lysine in that study. All right, last little bit here. We're going to talk a little more about MP and amino acids in the fresh cow. Okay, so just like we can calculate a negative protein balance, we can also calculate a negative energy balance. We can also calculate a negative protein balance. I was trying to read Clay's phone upside down to see how much more time I had. Okay, we're good. And so you see a nadir here on day 7 after calving, back in kind of neutral by about 21 days after calving. So this is calculated MP balance. So some folks in Denmark, Mogens Larsen and his group did some work, again, it's a little over 10 years ago now, but got a lot of our attention. Really small study, basically only 8 Holstein cows, so 4 control, 4 treatment. They all had rumen cannulas, abomasal infusion lines, and so they received either water infusions of control or casein infused in the abomasum, and all they were trying to do was really eliminate this deficit in MP. They weren't trying to go above, they were just trying to say, okay, if we can put enough protein, post-ruminally to eliminate that deficit, what will the cows do? Okay, and so they applied casein again, awesome amino acid profile, as I think you all know, at about 3/4 of a pound at 1 day in milk, so 1.5 pounds at 2 days in milk. So it's not atrocious amounts of protein here, right? But it's there. And then they started backing off as the cows' intakes came up, right? So all they're trying to do is get them up there and hold them level, okay? Look here at intakes. Intakes were the same, okay? MP supply, if you account for the abomasal infusion, was higher, okay, by design. And they got about 15 pounds more milk, okay, in those cows. So that's a small study, right? But that's a big milk response, okay, in a fresh cow. All right, so Trent Westhoff. Trent, again, just finished his PhD at Cornell working with Sabine Mann. I was on his committee and pretty involved in some of the stuff he was doing. So we wanted to look at prepartum and postpartum MP supply, okay, and really kind of challenge this thing. So we had far-off cows, and you see them expressing MPs as grams of metabolized protein per pound of dry matter, kind of typical far-off diet till about 28 days before calving. And then they either went on to a control diet, which was really designed to be kind of on the lower end of typical. We were kind of trying to get around 1,100 grams a day, maybe a little more, or high, 51 grams of MP per pound of dry matter, right? And then at calving, okay, the cows that were controlled, they either stayed kind of on a high cowish, roughly high cowish concentration of MP, or they went to a high level of MP. Okay, we're trying to get about 400 grams difference between these. And the high either went to the control or went to a high, right? So now one important design factor here is we used Van Amberg's numbers, granted for lactating cows, of grams of amino acid per mcal of ME. So instead of doing the percent of MP like we've done for a long time, we actually basically normalized methionine and lysine. Intakes were essentially the same across the treatments. So we basically fixed the grams of methionine and lysine these cows got, right? So what we're really looking at in this study is the effect of supplementing all the other amino acids beyond methionine and lysine to these cows, okay? And then 21 days after calving or 22 days after calving, they all went on to a common diet. All right, just going to cut to the chase here, right? We had a big response to post-calving MP, okay? So if you look here, I'll just roll down to energy corrected milk here. This is control high. Here's 11 pounds here. This is 19 pounds. right? So you kind of average that out a bit, right? So, there's a lot more milk. You could make an argument that maybe the cows that were on high protein before calving had a little better response. You know, that may not be, you know, that may be a little iffy, but clearly the big response was to the post-calving MP, okay? And again, none of our models really account for this, right? I mean, our models are built on cows in established lactation and things like that. So less so on this fresh cow where there's all kinds of wheels turning and things like that, okay? All right, looked at carryover responses here, day 22 to 42, right? And after they all went back on the same diet, these cows fed high protein after calving, continued to make about 11 pounds more energy-corrected milk, right? So at least through 42 days of milk, Trent had a carryover response there. All right, just some other stuff here. The cows fed the high protein before calving, had a little higher dry matter intake, expressed more a little further from calving than as they approach calving. They maintained a little higher body weight, okay? You see a difference in MP supply, okay? Glucoses, you know, not a whole lot, a little treatment by time, but kind of wonky there. This is prepartum. Not really much there with NEFAs, BHBAs. Obviously, plasma nitrogen was higher, you know, because any amino acids that's not used, right, they're gonna put that out as urea, okay? Post-calving, really some slight effects of dry matter intake, not very much, okay? The body weight thing kind of held true, right? So these cows fed the higher protein, you know, they maintained higher body weights, okay? You know, et cetera, okay? Just some other stuff here. We did see, if you look at BHBAs, saw a little bit higher BHBA in cows fed the more protein, but remember, some of those amino acids that get taken up in the liver, deaminated, are going to end up as ketones, right? So that's going to, you know, so that's just, to me anyway, that's more of an effect of more amino acids in the system. PUN's higher, no surprise there, okay? And then, so just to summarize, or talk about quickly other opportunities. I guess I'm good on time, right, Clay? Did I get you back on time? Okay. You know, I think the other opportunities we didn't really talk about, but clearly we've got opportunities to look at strategic use of other nutrients in the transition cow, and also feed additives. So you got obviously have things like choline, again, helping that liver metabolize fat, probably some other effects beyond that. Methionine and lysine we talked about, chromium, biotin. Better trace mineral sources. Again, there are data supporting use of improved trace mineral sources in diets for transition cows, and you know, certainly going beyond sulfates for sure. Sugars, fresh cow diets. Not as much research here as I'd like to see. Okay, you know, there's a lot of conjecture around sugar and stuff like that, but I'm hard pressed to point to a lot of studies that have really drilled in on sugar. You know, it's going to be less likely to drop rumen pH. You know, compared probably to starch, and so. You know, get a little butyrate there, so again, maybe some opportunity there, but again, nobody's really looked at it. I think the whole area of fatty acid nutrition, especially some of the anti-inflammatory fatty acids, are certainly worth further investigation. There's been some work there, and with some evidence and some promise, but it'd be nice to see a little more, and then we also think about some macro minerals there too. So I guess with that, there's my email address. I'm gonna be happy to share slides with anybody who wants to pop me a message, and thanks Clay and everybody for attending.
Thank you. Questions for Dr. Overton?
Yes, sir.
I have a question about rumination. How many hours you expect for fresh cow to ruminate within 24 hours? And what's the limit you concerned about the fresh cow rumination?
So, you know, again, I showed, you know, at least on SCR, 540 minutes or so, and it didn't, in diet, with widely varying diet composition, that's about where they kind of capped out, right? I can't pull top of my head what kind of rate of increase you want to see and stuff like that, but that would be there in some of the papers Julio Giordano's group has done. Stangaferro would be the first author on those, okay, where they're really validating some of the use of collars and tags relative to herd health.
Thank you very much. You confused us in the beginning a little bit with the starch, high, low, and it was not consistent, and then you took the NDF or the fiber content.
Yep.
So is there an optimum, like in starch, what you say, please go ahead with that, and is there then some kind of ratio that you need to take in account to the NDF that you put into the ration? Is there something more concrete that you can say on that?
Yeah. Good question. I mean, again, so you got to remember, I'm coming at it from a northeast-centric standpoint. So corn silage as the predominant forage base with some alfalfa grass silage. Diets running around 60% forage on a dry matter basis, plus or minus a little bit. We're pretty comfortable in that 27, 28% starch range. I would probably run, if you're running the CNCPS, I'd probably run PNDF instead of that 21-ish for a lactating cow diet, maybe get it toward 23, right? And then, UNDF, not all the models are fully seeded with UNDF information, but let's say your lactating cow diet, a high cow diet would run on a UNDF 240 basis, like say 6.5% of dry matter, something like that. I'd probably run it another percentage unit and a half, like 1.5 units higher, just a little bit higher, and see how that, I'd also watch intakes. Not a bad idea if you're going to play around with more fiber to run some BHBAs, right, before and after, because again, easy enough to do, and I showed you that when we overshoot the mark, that's what we're going to see is probably higher ketones because we're just got enough energy in those cows. Yep.